Oh, we got a beautiful baby over there. How you doing, ma'am? Yeah, I would like to. How old is she? 6 months old. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for bringing her. We want law and order for her above all else, right? That's why we're doing what we do. But I want to just say that being here in North Carolina, we're here to talk about law and order. We're here to talk about law enforcement, and we're here to talk about the basic fact that you all pay your taxes. They go to safe streets and safe cities. You ought to be able to enjoy the places that were built by your tax dollars. You ought to be afraid, the criminals ought to be afraid of you. You ought not be afraid of the criminals. It's very simple. And I think for too long in this country, we actually took the exact wrong approach. We told people that if you were walking down a city street and there was a crazy person over there yelling and screaming at your kids, you ought to walk to the other side of the street rather than possibly be accosted by a violent person. Well, you know what I think? I think that if a person is being violent and threatening to young children and young families, they ought to send their asses to prison instead of telling people that they got to cross the other side of the street. Now, and Ted is going to be mad at me. Ted is a good Christian man. He does not cuss. So, Ted, forgive me if I get a little fired up sometimes when I'm talking about this. Look, I've gotten in arguments with people before. You know, a couple years ago, I took my family to New York City. This was when I was in the United States Senate. We spent a few days there. It was a wonderful trip in a lot of ways. But, you know, every time we went to the subway, I'd have one of my kids grabbing onto my leg or afraid because there was a crazy person yelling, hollering, and screaming at a 3-year-old little kid. Why do we live like this? Why do we accept this in our communities? And the answer is because of bad political leadership. We have accepted for too long this idea that we ought to give over our streets to criminals and to vagrants and to people who are screaming at us instead of taking back our streets with our incredible law enforcement. And there are so many things that we can do. You know, in Washington, D.C., the first 2 months that we surged the National Guard, that President Trump surged the National Guard into Washington, D.C., there were no murders. Not a single murder for 2 weeks in the streets of Washington, D.C. And you know, we have all these world leaders who come. And we'll tell them, you know, we haven't had a murder in Washington, D.C. in 2 weeks. And these world leaders will look at us and say, is that supposed to impress us? Like, that doesn't sound very good. But you know, to Washington, D.C., which averaged last year a violent murder every other day, 2 weeks without a murder was a hell of a track record. And then we just surged the National Guard to Memphis, Tennessee. Again, a Democrat city in a red state, but where the mayor said, we are sick of our people being afraid to walk safely on the streets, so why don't you help us? And that's our basic attitude in the Trump administration is, look, we should not allow people to take over. We should not allow these violent criminals to take over city streets. And if the local government wants our help, if the local authorities want our help, then we are going to help them because we stand for American safety everywhere, whether it's a big city or a small one. Thank you, young man. So this is what it means. Being pro-law and order is actually not that difficult. There are some things we do, some issues we address that are so complicated and so challenging, but supporting our local law enforcement is actually pretty easy. It's just a question of political willpower. Here's thing number one, very simple. If our great police officers find a violent criminal and lock them up, we ought to keep them locked up instead of letting them back on our streets with a slap on the wrist. That means we want to give our police officers the very best equipment and the very best protection anywhere in the world. We want you guys to have the very best, and we're going to fight every single day to make sure that they have it. It means punishing state and local jurisdictions that restrict your ability to do police work. They just want to do their jobs. They ought to be allowed to do it. And it means pursuing enhanced sentences for violent criminals, like the violent criminal who murdered that poor innocent girl in Charlotte, North Carolina just a couple of months ago. And I want to talk about her for a second because I think, we got a beautiful baby over there. How you doing, ma'am? Yeah, I would like to. How old is she? 6 months old. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for bringing her. We want law and order for her above all else, right? That's why we're doing what we do.